You know, I'm really puzzled by something. It's 2026, believe it or not, and even though we live in this modern digital world where we can ask our smart assistants to close the blinds for us, we're still excited about finding oil. That feels weird to me. Petroleum is a 19th century technology, and here in the 21st century, very few of the things we use are powered by petroleum products. So, why are we still so obsessed with finding more oil? Well, there's a very simple reason. It just has to do with how oil, as a technology, works. Once we find new crude oil deposits and take some out of the ground, we then refine that oil into many useful products and things. However, by far the greatest portion of it is used to produce gasoline and diesel fuel, which power some of the machines we rely on. Now, those machines are great and have unlocked plenty of wonderful new possibilities for us, even whole new kinds of economies. While they've also come with some downsides that concern me and I think deserve more weight in our public conversations, you're not going to hear me tell you to stop using your machines. That is not at all what this video is about. But petroleum has an unavoidable issue, which is easy to ignore, but I don't think you should. It's disposable energy. In order for our machines to do things for us, like take us to work or get the kids to school, they burn the fuels which power them. That makes those fuels single-use, one and done. So, to keep using those machines, which most of us would like to do, we have no choice but to keep finding more oil to make more fuel. Many of us have come to the conclusion that this is a serious problem for a long list of reasons. For one thing, it makes our standard of living dependent on an extremely intensive resource extraction process which, since what that process yields will be burned shortly after it's created, appears to have no end in sight. Additionally, because oil deposits inevitably run dry, we often rely on extraction efforts happening in other countries, which may or may not be friendly. And while oil is relatively easy to store, meaning we can build reserves of oil, we use it a lot faster than you may realize. Our 714 million barrel strategic oil reserve sounds huge, but it only holds enough to sustain slightly more than a month of our current use. That's not a very long time. And even when we know we have a healthy and secure supply of oil, that oil costs a lot of money to find, extract, and refine into the fuels we buy to power our machines. That results in those fuels being fairly expensive to purchase as a consumer, and that results in a high and ongoing operating cost for any machines which use them, and that cost can change quite dramatically based on supply and demand. What's worse, since nearly every step in our economy currently involves something going on a truck which burns diesel fuel, spikes in oil prices make their way into virtually everything we buy. For those struggling to make ends meet, that can be the difference between well-fed and not, even if they don't drive a car. I truly believe that an honest assessment of the basic realities of using petroleum as a source of energy suggests that our situation is actually quite precarious. And if nothing else, it can really hurt the wallet sometimes. But, on that note, there's good news. We've developed an enormous variety of electric machines which don't use fuels to function at all. For instance, the screen you're looking at right now, and in fact nearly everything in your home. While today we still burn fuels to generate electricity, the even better news is that we don't have to do that anymore. We know how to build devices which generate electricity from nothing but sunlight, and though it has escaped the notice of many politicians, we also know how to build cost-effective, rechargeable, and recyclable batteries, which can be charged from the sun to store that energy for use whenever you'd like, even at night when the sun isn't shining. The bad news? There are a whole lot of people spending money and time trying to confuse everyone and convince us that everything I just said is a pie-in-the-sky idea which can never ever work. But I have never believed those people. Why? Simple. I'm a Midwesterner. Most of us that were born and raised here grew up learning the virtue of long-term thinking, something that seems to be less and less popular these days. My upbringing taught me to value things like durability and resilience, and to consider those factors when making important life decisions. Midwesterners are also big believers in getting the most value out of what we spend our money and time on. And we have learned that in many cases, the best value comes from spending more money up front on things which let you spend less money later. That old-fashioned Midwestern wisdom of frugality is what makes me so confident that we should be installing much more renewable energy capacity, and quickly. I didn't need scientific studies or lectures on climate change to form that opinion. I just know a good deal when I see one. The energy we capture from renewable sources like solar and wind power doesn't cost anything. And while the batteries we will use to support those sources are expensive to purchase, batteries can be used many, many more times than a gallon of gasoline can. Today's battery chemistries are pushing 5,000 charge cycles before they wear out, meaning they'll last well over a decade before they need to be recycled. And the future of batteries looks even brighter than that, with different chemistries extending lifespans, lowering costs, and reducing the use of harmful or hard-to-find materials in the construction of battery cells. These factors combined tell a clear story to me, which says renewable energy paired with long-lasting and reusable energy storage is the best deal out there, and we'd be foolish to pass it up. I would even go so far as to say that at this point, anyone who says otherwise is either lying to you to protect their own interests, or simply hasn't been paying attention to what things look like today. In 2026, the levelized cost of solar and storage, which includes the costs of purchasing both the panels and the batteries, is now lower than any other kind of energy production we know of. That seemed like the inevitable outcome to me for years because the sun is free, but for a long time solar panels were very expensive. Today, solar panels and batteries are now cheap enough to make that outcome real, now. And solar power is just one source of renewable energy. I believe that a renewable energy future should excite you because it allows us to harvest energy, not extract it. And once you really interrogate that difference, the noise goes away and the puzzle solves itself. Before I really get started, and yes, this video is quite long, isn't it? I have to make a few things clear. First, this video has two very distinct audiences in mind, and which one of those two I'm speaking to may not be entirely clear at any given moment. I'm telling you this because if you think you know where I'm going with something, you might be surprised. For example, this video is not trying to sell you anything like solar panels or home energy storage. Whenever I'm talking about renewable energy, people seem to think that's where I'm leading, but as a matter of fact, I do not have solar panels on my roof, and for various reasons, I personally don't even want to add them. I don't think any of us should have to put more thought into how we use electricity than we do right now, but I do think we should be moving as much of our energy demand to the electric grid as we can, and we should be doing that more and faster. I hope by the end you'll understand why I feel that way, and again, it might not be what you think. Second, there are going to be lots of comments down below which say things like, but what about the batteries? And a lot of them will be coming from a place of good faith. But lots of people ask that question in bad faith, and I would like you to know that anyone leaving those sorts of comments here probably didn't watch this video. What about the batteries is one of the central questions I intend to address. There's a lot of people being told to worry about things which I, for one, don't think you should be worrying much about, and I promise that I'll explain why I feel that way when we get there. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking a lot about cars, since many people have a deep connection to them, and they are the biggest reason we use so much oil. And, well, since electric cars now exist in large numbers, we can easily compare what a battery-powered world looks like to a petroleum-powered one, both in functionality and cost. Cars are just kind of the perfect tool to understand this at this moment, at least in my view. But the logic of this video can, and I think should, be applied to literally anything which burns any kind of fossil fuel. For instance, I still heat my home with natural gas, and natural gas has the exact same problems as oil. Since my furnace sets it on fire, it's a disposable, costly, single-use fuel we have to keep digging out of the ground if I want to keep using the furnace. It just happens to be delivered to my home through a metered pipe, rather than sold at fueling stations in a pay-as-you-go scheme. But with those things out of the way, let's get back to oil. We use crude oil for lots of things, but the most significant thing we use it for in the US is for producing refined gasoline for motor cars. So let's talk about the pinnacle of motor cars. This 2010 Nissan Cube. Hey, isn't that the car you bought to make videos on engine management technology? Yes? When is that happening? We're getting there. Oh, carry on then. Now, if you were paying close attention to the intro, this section might feel a bit repetitive, and I apologize if it does. But there are two core facts about using this car, which I'd really like you to think deeply about and confront. The first fact is that as this car does its job of providing transportation, it burns the gasoline that's inside its fuel tank. This means you constantly have to replace that fuel if you want to keep driving the car. That's easy enough to do, but the second core fact about using this car is that it costs you money every time you replace that fuel. I know you already know both of those facts, but the reason I said I'd like you to confront them is because that's just a normal reality to lots of people. And it's so normal that we do a really bad job keeping those ongoing costs in mind when we make comparisons to new technologies. For example, have you ever thought about just how much gasoline a car like this will burn over its life? This little fella has traveled nearly 188,000 miles since it was built. Nissan Cubes with a manual transmission like this one have an EPA fuel economy rating that comes in at 25 city, 30 highway. And if we assume that all of those miles were highway miles, which I'm sure isn't true, but we'll give this fella all the benefits of doubt we can, then this car burned through a gallon of gas every 30 miles it went down the road. And so, 188,000 miles divided by 30 miles per gallon tells us that so far this car has burned through about 6,250 gallons of gasoline. Here's a fun fact, that's more than half of one of these. Yeah, those big trucks that actually deliver gasoline to fueling stations, the largest ones hold 11,600 gallons. So this one little car, assuming all highway miles, I remind you, has burned through about 54% of what the biggest tanker trucks can hold. And if you're thinking, buying half a tanker truck of gas sounds expensive, you'd be right. Let's say those 6,250 gallons were burned evenly over the past 15 years, spanning 2011 and 2025. Using the average historical monthly prices in the US during that time tells us that it cost something like $19,500 to purchase all the gasoline this car has used. That's more than the car cost when it was new. Spending nearly 20 grand on gasoline certainly hurts the wallet, but the reason drivers of this car had to spend that much comes back to one of those really core facts I've been asking you to confront. You can only use a gallon of gasoline once. Every 30 miles you go in this car means you have to buy another gallon of gas, and this will never, ever change. That fact is one of the reasons we started to look into the viability of electric cars. Now, I won't bother you with a history lesson here, so we'll just jump ahead to 2022, which is when I bought this one. This is a Hyundai Ioniq 5, and I've had a mostly fantastic time with the car. Hyundai still doesn't seem to know what exactly is going on with the whole ICCU failure thing, which is very reassuring, and oh boy, they really need to release a software update which gives us a button to turn on battery preconditioning manually, because until they do, doing long-distance drives in the winter will get increasingly annoying with its terrible navigation system. I'm not salty, it is. But aside from the ICCU and my bugbears, I've had 4 trouble-free years with this car. In the time I've had it, it's gone nearly 50,000 miles, and it hasn't burned a single drop of gasoline. It can't. Ain't got an engine. Aha! The comments erupt, but you had to plug it into the power grid to charge it, and the power grid still burns stuff. Now, folks, that's what we call a gotcha. People say that in conversation to undermine the point of electric cars and make their buyers feel foolish. However, Something that's pretty nifty about electric cars is that they can be charged from any source of energy that generates electricity. That could be nuclear power, it could be hydroelectric power, or it could be all that natural gas we have here in the US. Hydraulic fracturing has freed up so much gas that we're now a net exporter. And with abundant, cheap gas, some 40% of our electricity generation these days comes from gas-fired power plants. This car, since it's electric, can make use of that abundant and cheap resource. If nothing else, it's using fuel we already have and control, which has national security benefits. But what excites me the most is that this car can also be charged with these. This is a photovoltaic solar panel. You simply point it at the sun, and then electricity comes out of these two wires for the low, low cost of free. Now, many people quite understandably feel as if that's simply too good to be true, and there's gotta be a catch. Of course, the biggest catch is that the sun doesn't shine at night. But, you know, this electric car has headlights and taillights because, through the power of batteries, you can drive it at night. So I'm reasonably sure that's something we can figure out. But we'll be talking about batteries and the materials they're made from later on in this video. Ah, materials. In many ways, that's what this video is really trying to get you to think about. And they're responsible for the second catch of solar energy. But no, not what those materials are. We'll get there. Instead, I mean simply that I can't really say this panel generates electricity for the low, low price of free because the panel itself wasn't free. It's made of raw materials, which cost the manufacturer money to obtain. And of course, the manufacturer wanted to be paid for their work, turning those materials into a functional product. And so did everyone else at every step of the turn raw materials into a product and get it to Harbor Freight so some weird YouTuber guy can buy it process. That meant this solar panel cost a whole lot more than a gallon of gas. But unlike a gallon of gas, using this thing doesn't require destroying it. The useful life of gasoline is exactly once, but the useful life of a solar panel is on the order of decades. That is how solar energy became the least expensive form of electricity. Sure, the panels may be expensive to purchase, but we are using materials to build a durable thing. An object with no moving parts, and that which harvests energy from the sun, which is free, and will do so for decades. When you average the cost of purchasing solar panels over the many thousands of days they will produce a free energy harvest, the apparently high upfront cost becomes pennies a day per panel. Now, as I've already said, I don't have any interest in putting these things on my rooftop. Our electricity here in Illinois is already pretty cheap, and I'm not looking to cut the cost of charging my car. With a bit of optimization, which really means by charging my car exclusively at night when the grid is quiet, today already it only costs about 1/3 as much to drive my car as it does to buy gas for a car like the Cube. But thought experiments are pretty fun, so let's say for the moment I was interested in installing a photovoltaic array on my roof to make my own energy for my own car. What would those costs look like? Well, in case you haven't noticed, the cost of manufacturing solar panels has been dropping like a rock. How do you think Harbor Freight gets their hands on them? It's pretty wild. Have you ever thought about how weirdly cheap big TVs are these days? A very similar thing has been happening in the land of photovoltaics, and new solar panels are miraculously cheap. Let's say that instead of spending $19,500 on gasoline for this weird little car, I spent that amount of money on solar panels. How many could I buy these days? Well, if I Google solar panel wholesale and click on various solar panel wholesaler websites, it's looking like I can buy a few pallets of them. This website sells pallets with 32 of these 500-watt panels for $5,600. That's $175 per panel, and they have a 25-year warranty. That price means the $19,500 in this car's total fuel cost could today buy 111 of those panels, way more than I could possibly fit on my rooftop, and enough to generate a theoretical 55,000 watts of power. That many solar panels, incidentally, represents about 6 or 7 complete rooftop solar installations for an average single-family home. Think about that. The same $19,500 in capital which got spent on gasoline, which this one small car burned through and will never be seen again, could today purchase all the solar panels necessary to completely power a half-dozen homes for decades. I don't know, the math doesn't seem to be mathing very well for gasoline, but let's compare apples to apples here. How many of those 500-watt panels would someone like me, who lives in Chicagoland and drives about 13,000 miles each year, need on their rooftop, in Chicagoland, to charge a Hyundai Ioniq 5 in the middle of December? 12. I'll need 12 of those panels, which means if I spend some $2,100 on solar panels today, then I will have completely taken care of my car's lifetime energy costs. That right there, folks, is why I'm so confident renewable energy is the future. If I were to spend just a little bit more than I did on my last TV upgrade, I will have pre-purchased all of the fuel this car will ever need. Yes, of course, I'm skipping a whole bunch of details, like the labor to install those panels and the racking and the wires and stuff, but I'm also skipping the fact that once we're out of the winter months, those 12 panels will produce way more electricity than my car needs, and in fact could power my entire home on most days. The essential and core fact to confront here, and this is a fact that often gets overlooked in debates, is that renewable energy capacity is not disposable. It is in fact durable, and that makes it functionally a one-time investment. You only have to buy and install these things once, and then they simply sit there generating free electricity for years to come. All they might need after installation is a bit of cleaning every once in a while. That stands in stark contrast to fossil fuels, which you have to keep buying forever. So, going back to the example of the Cube and my Hyundai, the choice becomes, do you spend $1,300 on fuel every single year, or do you spend an extra $800 this year to eliminate your fuel costs for a quarter of a century? Choice seems pretty clear to me. So now you might be wondering why I said I don't want solar panels on my own personal roof. Well, the quickest way to answer that is to go on a field trip. Behind me is a 27 megawatt solar farm that was built here in the town of Depew, Illinois. Now there's a couple notable things about that. First, Illinois is not exactly the solar power capital of the country. It's cloudy as I'm filming this, and we're kinda high up in the latitudes. And yet, there's a 27 megawatt solar farm that got built in Depew, Illinois. Why did that happen? Well, because people who like to make money understand the difference between CapEx and OpEx. And so do you, even if you don't know what those terms mean. I'll explain them shortly, but first, do you know anyone with a backup generator? That question might sound out of left field, but I promise you it's a perfect way to understand this. Some people live where the electricity grid isn't as reliable as they'd like it to be. Everyone hates power outages because electricity is extremely important to our lives at this point. And if grid reliability is poor enough where someone lives, they might elect to install a large backup generator powered by natural gas, which will automatically kick on and generate electricity during a power outage. When someone decides to spend their money that way, that's CapEx, or capital expenditure. They are using their capital to buy a durable thing, which will last them many years, and it becomes an investment in the future. Some folks install generators which are large enough to power their entire home, meaning power outages are nothing but an inconvenient blip. And that leads to what I think is an interesting and revealing question to ponder. If those people own a machine which can power everything in their home by itself, why don't they get their money's worth out of it and just use that machine all the time? Why stay connected to the power grid at all? Well, that's because that machine needs fuel to generate electricity. And that fuel costs money, which makes it part of OpEx, which is short for operating expenditure. The gas company will charge you for the gas that generator uses, and those fuel costs mean that using a backup generator is much more expensive than pulling energy directly from the power grid. Everyone with a backup generator knows this, and that's why it's a backup and not their primary source of electricity. It is simply too expensive to use that machine all the time. The great big machines on the power grid, even when they're burning the same natural gas as a backup generator, can capture much more of the energy contained in the fuel they burn and turn it into electricity than the small engine inside a Generac can. That efficiency of scale is what makes generating electricity cheaper for grid-scale power stations. And the fact that the wires which connect your house to the grid are already there and were paid for perhaps decades ago explains why distributing that energy through the power grid is very efficient, both economically and from an energy perspective. And what's really important to remember is that grid power is cheaper despite the fact that the people who operate natural gas plants are making a healthy profit. They're not just running a power plant for the fun of it, they're in business. But the smarter business critters out there know that even with the benefits of scale, a natural gas plant still has a very high OPEX. Each unit of electricity a gas plant generates requires burning expensive fuel, which eats into profits. So, for those who have an eye on making money, when solar farms pop up and demonstrate that we can produce electricity with no input costs at all, well, gas doesn't look so great anymore. See, all a solar farm operator needs to do is sell their electricity for slightly less than it costs a competing natural gas plant to make it, and that's what they'll do. That's good for consumers because that makes electricity cheaper to use, but because the solar farm has next to zero OPEX, it still generates a healthy profit even though it's cheaper. And savvy business people who think long-term will use those profits to build more solar farms. The basic realities of economics mean that photovoltaics are, at this point, frankly unstoppable. The sun doesn't cost any money to use, which means all of the energy a solar panel produces is free. And that means whatever price you can sell that energy for on the power grid energy market is almost purely profit once the panels have been paid off. Best of all, grid-scale energy storage in the form of electrochemical batteries has gotten cheap enough that it is now possible, today, to build a solar farm with batteries that can produce energy 24/7, and all the while doing that for a lower cost than any other source of electricity. And since both photovoltaic panels and batteries are manufactured in factories, which can leverage economies of scale, they're just gonna keep getting cheaper to manufacture. The economics are already in favor of solar and storage, but they're gonna keep looking better and better every year. Solar energy has put us on the cusp of a positive feedback loop, yet relatively few people seem to have realized this. And that's despite the fact that there's another one not even 5 miles up the road here in Spring Valley, Illinois. Solar farms are starting to pop up everywhere, even in states like Illinois, because the business case simply makes so much sense. It's farming a crop, just like we do with land today, but that crop gets harvested every single day, rather than once a year, and virtually no work is involved in harvesting that crop. Plus, the crop doesn't need inputs in the form of water or fertilizer or pesticide or seed. You just plop some panels on some land, angle them to get the most energy out of the sun as you can, and let the money roll in. This is a capitalist's wet dream. People are always talking about passive income as if that's a panacea. Well, there it is! You can become a farmer and all you'll have to do is mow the grass between the panels a few times a year. The fact that there's this amazing business opportunity out there is why solar farms are happening in the first place. And they're leveraging the power grid we already have, which can move energy from one place to another. And that's why I'm not that interested in putting panels on my roof. Yes, there are good arguments for distributing energy resources, and we have a real problem right now with getting new transmission lines permitted. There are a ton of solar power projects which are already funded, but aren't happening because FERC can't get their act together and they're stuck in permitting hell. NIMBYs aren't helping either. Pushing individuals to install solar on their rooftop is one way to bypass some of these issues, and it does have some advantages, But many people don't have the agency to install solar on their roof even if they wanted to and could afford it. Renters can't do that even if they're renting a house, and what's worse, apartment buildings don't have enough roof space to be self-sufficient. Cities will always be relying on solar farms. There are many more reasons I'm not a big fan of pushing people towards buying their own panels and batteries, which I'll spare you for time. Bottom line, I will gladly pay these small businesses which are daring to build the future through my power bills and think that's a far more efficient use of my money. But speaking of efficient uses of things, let's address some of the concerns I know many of you out there have about solar energy. Like land use. Solar farms do indeed require a lot of space. That 27 megawatt solar farm in Depew is on something like a 120-acre site. I used an online tool and drew a circle around the access road to come up with that figure, so I can't guarantee it's accurate, but that's what I'm going to roll with. Now, 27 megawatts is a tremendous amount of power, but in the context of the power grid, it's pretty piddly. This is the three-phase line that connects the solar farm to the substation in Depew, and it's, well, it ain't exactly a big transmission line, now is it? So yeah, solar energy will use lots of land. However, since I'm from Illinois, I think I'm qualified to explain why you probably don't need to worry too much about land use. That is a cornfield. It doesn't look like much right now because it's the middle of January, but corn used to be growing there and it was harvested in the fall. Now, there's three very notable things about this reality. First of all, this land should not look like this. This is Illinois. We're the prairie state. The natural environment is prairie. And now there's virtually none of that left because it has all been turned into farms. Secondly, we only get one harvest per year out of this land. We spend all the summer growing the corn, and then in the fall it's harvested just once. If this was a solar farm, it could have a harvest every single day. And third, if you're thinking, well, what if we stop growing corn there? We can't eat anymore. Well, this corn is not the corn that you eat. Some of it does end up in lots of different food products, but a large portion of this corn gets used for that. Yeah, those messages on gas pumps, which say may contain up to 10% ethanol, that came from corn. We have been using an astonishing amount of our rich agricultural land to grow corn to feed to cars. Maybe you remember the days of flex fuel vehicles and E85 being relevant. Well, back in 2005, President George W. Bush signed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and in 2007 he signed the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Those acts mandated a specific amount of ethanol in gallons which needs to be produced so it can be mixed with gasoline. The idea, as you might have gleaned from the independence and security part, was to start making our own energy for cars so that we'd be less dependent on foreign oil. A policy I wholeheartedly support. The only trouble is that doing it with corn ethanol is tremendously stupid. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that we only get one corn harvest per year. Now, an acre of cornfield might be able to produce 550 gallons of corn ethanol when all is said and done. I'd like to note that it takes an awful lot of chemistry and energy to turn corn into ethanol, but we'll just ignore that and pretend it's easy and free. So, let's go back to that solar farm. If this were a 120-acre cornfield, then at the end of the year we can get maybe 66,000 gallons of ethanol out of it. That's about 5 tanker trucks worth. Now, if you didn't already know this, ethanol is less energy dense than gasoline, so E85 vehicles which run on E85 have a really poor fuel economy in miles per gallon. It's about a 40% penalty. But I'll be generous. Let's say those 66,000 gallons of corn ethanol all make it into cars that can go 30 miles on a gallon of E85. How far can they drive? Well, 66,000 gallons times 30 tells us that they can go just shy of 2 million miles. That might seem like a lot, but now let's consider how many miles electric cars that are being charged from the 27 megawatts of solar panels on a 120-acre plot of land can drive every year. The operator of that solar farm's website claims it generates about 37,000 megawatt hours of energy every year. Well, the website says in year 1, so it's possible it wasn't yet complete when they came to that figure, but I'm just going to roll with it. Electric cars generally get something like 3 or 4 miles per kilowatt hour. But let's go ahead and make the picture worse for them and say they can only manage 2, which is what my car can get down to in extreme cold. Well, 37,000 megawatt hours is 37 million kilowatt hours. So every year, these panels can push electric cars at least 74 million miles. That's 2 million miles of driving each year from corn versus 74 million miles of driving from solar panels. So, do you really think we should still be growing corn to feed to cars? Here's the best part though. Let's say you decided the answer is no, and we stopped growing corn to feed to cars. How many acres of cornfields would that free up? Well, this website I found says we've got 96 million acres of land growing corn in this country. And depending on how you count, between 25 and 40% of all that acreage is devoted to ethanol. So, let's just say we took a slightly fudged quarter of that land, 25 million acres, and covered it all in solar panels. How much energy would that harvest? Well, that's going to depend on where the panels are, and since we're going to do a thought experiment here where we put the panels in the Corn Belt, let's just keep using the numbers from the solar farm in Depew. Up here in Illinois, we can get 37,000 megawatt hours per year out of 120 acres. So let's see. 25 million divided by 120, and then multiplied by 37,000. That is 7,708,333,000 megawatt hours of energy. And why is that the best part? Because that's more energy than the entire US electricity grid produces right now, and by a lot. In 2023, it all added up to 4.178 billion megawatt hours. So, if all we did was decide to stop growing corn to turn into ethanol, and we used only that land for generating only solar power, we'd be able to generate 84% more electricity on an annual basis than we do today from all of our energy sources. I hope that helps you understand why I'm not that worried about the land solar panels will take up. We've got a whole lot of it, and we're not exactly using it responsibly at the moment anyway. And by the way, I used real-world numbers from a real-world solar installation to perform this thought experiment in the hopes that that would be more convincing. But just in case you doubt my numbers, which I understand because I used the numbers from the company's website, there have been plenty of studies which demonstrate this, and I'll link them below. What's most notable is that up here in the Corn Belt, we actually have a pretty bad capacity factor. Solar panels would be much more productive if they were somewhere farther south and sunnier. But even with our mediocre latitude and weather patterns, all the land we need to generate electricity with solar power alone can be freed up if we just stop growing corn to feed to cars. So far in this video, I've been talking a lot about solar energy, but you know, I also like those things. Yeah, let's talk about wind turbines for a second. Something interesting you can do with these is put them in fields alongside crops and farm the wind and some corn at the same time. You can actually also do that with solar panels. It's called agrivoltaics, and it's a really exciting area of research, but we'll set that aside. This video is already quite long. Now, some people look at a wind turbine and see a pointless boondoggle which clutters the landscape, but I, on the other hand, see a magnificent machine which turns wind into gasoline. Here's a fun thought experiment. Each one of these wind turbines can generate 2 megawatts of power, and on a windy day like today, that's probably what they're putting out. If this car could actually handle that much power, how long do you think it would take one of those wind turbines, just one, to charge this car's battery? The answer is 2.5 minutes. Seriously, not even 2.5 minutes. And if we consider that this car has a driving range of about 240 miles, and then equate that to a gasoline-powered car that gets 40 miles per gallon, then you can very much imagine these machines as wind-powered oil derricks that generate about 3 gallons of refined gasoline every single minute. If you're having a hard time imagining what that looks like, most shower heads run at something like 2 gallons per minute. So imagine you had a shower running all the time that was spitting out gasoline, which you could bottle and sell. And that's what just one of those wind turbines does. And how much does the wind cost? Slightly more than the sun, but it's still free. Wind power is obviously quite useful. For one thing, these work just fine on cloudy days and even work at night. But these are gigantic machines with moving parts, which need much more maintenance than a solar panel does. In fact, while I was out at this wind farm, this one in the background was stopped because there was a crew performing maintenance. That's OpEx. So while a wind farm still has a very, very low OpEx compared to a power plant which burns a costly fuel, wind turbines are not quite as cost competitive as solar panels. Photovoltaics are very much a kind of solid-state energy generation, and a big machine like that is very much not. But let's pretend wind power doesn't exist. This is a silly thing to pretend because it does, but I want us to return to the purely solar-powered thought experiment. Because in the room where that thought experiment takes place, there is an elephant. Covering 25 million acres in solar panels is going to require building many millions of solar panels. Billions, in fact. And that's going to require a whole heck of a lot of raw materials. Now, I do think it's worth pointing out that the fruit of extracting those raw materials will function for decades. We use an even heckier heck of a lot of raw materials right now when we extract and refine oil, and all the fruits of that process function exactly once. You don't notice all the mass you're burning through right now because it mostly exists in your mind as nothing but numbers on a gas pump. Unless you're filling a jerry can, you don't even see it. But there's a reason those tanker trucks are constantly showing up and delivering more fuel to each and every gas station. Cars burn that fuel, and it's constantly disappearing. I, for one, think we should spend our efforts extracting resources which will hang around for a while. Just seems a little wiser. Regardless, solar panels are large, fairly heavy things, and each one is made from a substantial amount of material. So, it's worth talking about what the raw materials inside these things actually are. And that's why I bought this one. And that one, but we'll get back to that. So, these slender black things with all the lines on them are the actual solar cells. These are what convert the photons from the sun that land on them into electrons, which can be sent down a wire and harnessed as energy. Those cells are extremely thin. We're talking about as thin as a human hair. And that means the vast, vast majority of this panel's mass is simply panel. Almost all of what makes up this thing is either aluminum, glass, or adhesives. 72 silicon cells were arranged and wired together and then glued to this sheet of glass. Once that was done, the backside of the glass gets coated in some kind of thermoplastic to seal it all up and make it watertight. A hole in that coating was left for lead wires to connect the solar cells to this junction box, and then the box was attached to the backside of the glass with sealant. Oh, and if you're wondering what's inside that junction box, sometimes it's a circuit board with a microinverter to allow the panel to spit out the same AC power that the grid runs on. But in this case, this is a DC solar panel, so all that's in there are a couple of beefy diodes. And, well, the last major thing in here is aluminum. The aluminum frame gives some structure to the glass and provides an easy way to mount it, but that's really all it's there for. I'm not that well versed on all the ways these things are constructed, so I don't want to falsely assert that most of them are made like this one is, and a lot of panels now have solar cells on both sides. Those are known as bifacial panels. But no matter how they're made, it's mostly just glass and aluminum. I think that's notable because those are both materials which are so cheap and easy to get that we use them for food containers. And it's also notable because these food containers, mainly glass bottles and jars and aluminum cans, are something we already actively recycle. It would be better if we reused glass containers rather than ground them up and melted them, but that's an issue for another time. The important thing is, we already know how to do that, and we already have industrial processes which turn used, ground-up glass into new glass, and which melt scrap aluminum into new aluminum. So, at the end of this panel's useful life, which won't be for 25 years, almost all of its raw material mass can easily be recovered and turned into another panel, which is important. When it comes to the actual silicon cells, well, you've probably heard or heard someone say that these things are full of toxic materials. That's misinformation, and let me explain why. There are some kinds of solar cell that we've been experimenting with, like thin film solar cells or perovskite cells, which require some less than great elements in their construction. But those represent only about 5% of panels made today. The vast majority are using monocrystalline silicon at this point, which is a material we derive from quartz. You know, rocks. There are some trace elements of phosphorus, boron, and silver in here, but based on what I've researched, the only potentially harmful substance people might worry about in this is lead in the solder which makes electrical connections. You can see some of it right here. But I'm not actually sure that lead is even in this panel. We've had lead-free solder for quite some time, though as any electronics enthusiast will tell you, it can be annoying to work with because it doesn't flow as well as when there's a little lead in the mix. I say that because it's possible these will always have to use lead solder to get a good bond with the silicon cells. But even if that's true, we know how to deal with lead. Did you know that new lead-acid batteries are almost entirely made from old lead-acid batteries? Every time you buy a car battery from a store, you're going to have to pay what's called a core charge, which you don't get refunded until you bring your old battery back to the store, and that's to encourage recycling. This system works so well that we capture about 99% of the material in dead car batteries. We have a nearly closed-loop recycling stream already established for them. That's some foreshadowing for the what about the batteries section, but I'm really saying it here to let you know we can absolutely figure out how to capture the lead in these safely and reuse it. We just have to want to. And speaking of recycling, there's absolutely no reason we couldn't also recycle the silicon inside of these. The worn-out solar cells could be melted down and purified into new silicon to make new wafers to make new cells at the end of a panel's life. But even if, for some reason, we never figure that out or it's never economically viable, you have to remember two things. First, each panel will last 1/4 of a century or longer. And second, those cells are extremely thin, usually less than 200 micrometers, and thus have almost no material in them at all. I wanted to remove the cells from this panel so I could actually weigh them and tell you just how much of this panel's mass the silicon cells constitute, but they're so thin and fragile that I could not peel away the coating which seals them to the glass without destroying them. I tried several different solvents, hoping to dissolve some of the adhesives in here, but I had no luck at all. The magic of buying 2 of them has, unfortunately, failed us. However, I has internet! Assuming a thickness of 200 micrometers, which appears to be on the thick side these days, then if we stacked up all 72 of these cells, they'd make a stack which is just 1.4 centimeters tall. The total volume would thus be about 94.5 cubic centimeters, and the density of silicon is about 2.3 grams per cubic centimeter, meaning this solar panel has maybe 215 grams of silicon in it. That's about 3% of its total mass. Now, this is only a 100-watt panel, and most panels sold today are larger with more cells. But that still means we're looking at about 1 kilogram of silicon per 500-watt solar panel on the high end. Now, that's not a lot for an individual panel, but if we followed through with the Corn Belt thought experiment, we'd need about 10 billion panels, so well, those panels are going to need something like 5 or 10 million metric tons of silicon. And that is certainly a lot. But it's probably not as much as you might think. For one thing, right now, in the US, we put some 265 million metric tons of stuff in landfills every year. So if we simply landfilled all that silicon, which I will remind you represents the silicon necessary to completely power the entire US electricity grid from solar energy and nothing else, we'd only be taking up less than 1/10 of our yearly landfill capacity by mass, and we'd only need to do that every quarter of a century. Remember how I said I'd only need 12 of those solar panels to provide enough energy to drive my car in the winter? That's what's really important to remember. The amount of silicon, or in fact whatever material in a solar panel might concern you, that each person in this country will end up utilizing in this imagined future scenario is very small. And when you remember that each of the solar panels is going to last a solid quarter of a human lifetime, if not longer, then the amount of material used per day is irrelevant. Anyone trying to get you to focus on that is fear-mongering and deflecting your attention away from the fact that currently we burn through millions of barrels of oil every day. And now, here we are. What about the batteries? If we actually live in this imagined future of nothing but solar energy, which in case it's not clear, I don't think we will because we have many different sources of energy available to us as well, but if we actually live in this future, we have to deal with when the sun's not shining. And we do that with batteries. We would be building much more solar power capacity than we can actually use when the sun is shining, and the excess we're not using will charge enormous banks of batteries, so that when the sun sets and the panels stop producing any output, we have stored energy to get us through to sunrise. We're also going to have long-term storage available to get us through periods of bad weather. But of course, we can also use this high-tech idea called wires and move energy from sunny deserts to cloudy places. There's a huge variety of ways we could solve this issue, and that's one of the cool things about electricity. But no matter what, we're going to need to build a whole heck of a lot of batteries, and those suckers absolutely do have some nasty chemicals in there, and we're going to need to extract a whole lot of raw material from mines and whatnot to get them. However, if you understand the logic of lifespan, you'll know what I'm about to say. Most people who say, "But what about the batteries?" seem to always ignore two core facts about batteries. The first fact is that they last many years now. In fact, some of the latest batteries, with a daily charge cycle, should get to 15 years old before they start degrading significantly. That's 15 years of daily use of the same battery pack, as opposed to fossil fuels, which can all be used, I remind you, once. And the second core fact is that when those batteries have degraded, they're still there. When battery cells degrade, it's not as if the material inside of them is disappearing. What's actually happening is that the physical arrangement of those materials is slowly changing. As the reversible chemical reaction, which we call charging and discharging the battery, occurs inside, little bits of material in the anodes and cathodes can start breaking off and moving around, creating structures inside that eventually start to block the chemical reaction from happening and reduce the battery cell's ability to function. But that does not mean any of the materials have transformed into something else. You can't take a lithium atom, for example, and turn it into iron. All the lithium that was in there when the battery was made is still there. So when the battery wears out, all of the lithium inside can be recovered. Let's talk about mining for a second. When we find new deposits of some substance we're looking for, it's not as if someone just happens upon a giant lump of pure cobalt and we start cutting chunks out of it. No, we find a deposit of ore, which is rich in that material. Then we'll dig up that ore and do lots of fancy processing to extract the cobalt or whatever from the rest of the rocks and purify it. Why am I telling you this? Because the richest ore for whatever material you need to build a battery is used batteries. We are already starting up processes where we grind up used lithium-ion batteries and turn them into a mineral-rich paste, which, just like the raw ore we get out of the ground, can be processed into the raw material inputs that built that battery in the first place. Jerry Rig Everything has a 2-year-old video about this process, and I'll link to it in the description if you'd like to see it. Unlike fossil fuels, where we toil away extracting and purifying resources just so that we can sell them, put them in our gas tanks, and set them on fire, when we're building a battery, we're building something. We're extracting and purifying resources to make a durable good, which will last many, many years. And because that durable good doesn't disappear once we've used it, like fossil fuels do, everything inside that durable good can be recovered. That's kind of the whole point of renewable energy. It's called renewable because it's not disposable. It's a resource we can use again and again and again without worrying about running out. Now, a lot of people like to point out that we don't have a huge industry recycling lithium-ion batteries yet. But that's mostly because we don't have a huge supply of dead lithium-ion batteries yet. The biggest supply comes from electric cars with worn-out battery packs, but again, modern battery chemistries in thermally controlled battery packs last decades. So aside from first-gen Nissan Leafs, which had a uniquely terrible battery pack design, most electric cars that were built in the last 15 years still have their original battery packs. The biggest reason we end up with used packs is cars getting into collisions and becoming totaled. That happens way more often than a battery pack failure. So it's not like a recycling industry isn't going to happen. In fact, it's already happening. But it doesn't seem to be at a very large scale yet, because most EV batteries are still in service. And a lot of folks are buying used EV battery packs from totaled cars and the like to repurpose them for stationary energy storage, meaning they are still in use, they're just not in a car. But there's another rather enormous reason I think, but what about the batteries, is a misplaced concern. That reason? We're still learning. We are constantly learning how to build better batteries. Name any material of concern inside a battery pack, and I can guarantee you there are engineers out there trying to eliminate it. Lithium iron phosphate cells, for example, don't contain nickel, manganese, or cobalt. And in addition to eliminating the need for conflict minerals, LFP battery chemistry is also much more stable, meaning the risks of battery fires have been reduced dramatically. And we're on the cusp of commercializing sodium-ion batteries, which don't use lithium at all. They use sodium. You know, the stuff in ramen noodles. Table salt. The stuff we can get simply by filling a pot with seawater and waiting a while. Sodium-ion batteries are not as energy dense, so they'll probably not be a great fit for electric cars, but they'll be a fantastic fit for the large, grid-scale energy storage facilities which are already being built all the time. And if you've read about battery fires at those facilities, that's a huge reason we're looking into sodium-ion. That chemistry is far more stable and seems nearly immune from thermal runaway risks from what I understand. We are constantly learning new things as we try to crack this nut. I remind you, the energy we get from solar panels is free. So there is a huge incentive for us to figure out how to use this free energy when the sun isn't shining. We are, and have always been, working on building better, cheaper, longer-lasting, less dangerous batteries which use materials we can find in our own backyard. So whatever you've heard that might make you concerned is not guaranteed to be relevant in the next few years or even tomorrow. And because every single battery we build will still be there when it wears out, barring accidents of course, we have the ability to reprocess those batteries into fresh, new batteries without extracting more virgin materials. That's the end game. I've seen a lot of people say things like, well, lithium is just going to become the new oil, but that completely misunderstands the realities here. We cannot stop extracting oil because we burn it as we use it. Yes, renewable energy technology will require lots of extraction to build, but we don't destroy what we extracted. That is what we do with fossil fuels. We burn them as we use them, and that's the problem. There's scarcity built into fossil fuels because it disappears. Each and every gallon of gasoline you've ever purchased, except for what's sitting in your gas tank right this moment, is gone. But the battery pack I purchased alongside my car is still with us. It's right there. All of the raw materials it's made from are still inside of it, and we are able to get to them. And so when it's no longer doing its job as I need it to, it will live another life. Just as the steel which makes up the rest of the car will be crushed and turned into new cars, the minerals inside that battery pack will be processed into their pure form and used to build new batteries. And even if we never figure out how to make better batteries and we're stuck with lithium-ion from now until the end of time for some reason, eventually we'll have built enough of them to do everything we need to do. I'm not buying a new battery pack for my car because it's already got one, and it's still working. And once we've built enough batteries for grid-scale energy storage, well, we'll have built enough batteries. There does come a day when we have built enough, because we only use energy when we choose to do things, like cook food or drive a car. And there's only so many humans on this planet choosing to do stuff. And when they start wearing out, then yeah, those batteries will need replacement. But that doesn't mean we'll have to keep mining for more lithium forever. We'll have to find some new lithium to make up for whatever is lost in the recovery process. But if we can follow the example of lead-acid battery recycling and all but completely close the loop, then in a theoretical 50 years down the road scenario, perhaps 1 in 100 lithium mines will remain operational. The rest of them will have closed down, because when we need to build new batteries, we'll get lithium from old batteries. But the best part is something I mentioned way back at the start. We're already here. Solar and storage is now the cheapest form of electricity generation we know of. For years, the barrier to making solar energy happen at scale was simply cost. We had functional solar panels decades ago, but they were ludicrously expensive to manufacture, and that's why the only places you tended to find them were on, like, the International Space Station and satellites and junk. But now we are way under $1 per watt. Random websites will sell me, a random schmuck, solar panels which go for just 35 cents a watt. And they'll certainly get cheaper than that. They already are when you have a contract for 27 megawatts worth. Of course, I care deeply about the materials angle, and appreciate the fact that unlike all fossil fuels, nearly everything we extract out of the ground to build solar panels and batteries can be recaptured at the end of their life to make new solar panels and batteries. I like that a lot. But even if you don't care about that, the sun is free, and both solar panels and batteries are now cheap enough to make practical use of that free source of energy. We are here. We made it. And the future looks quite bright.